All right. Today we'll be talking about Welsh English, which is a particular dialect found mostly in Wales. It also is sometimes called Anglo-Welsh or Wanglish. And one of the things that characterizes it in particular is it's obviously got a heavy influence from the United Kingdom, but over time it's also had more and less influence from Welsh itself, and that's kind of fluctuated and is very apparent in certain habits of speaking in traditional speakers as well as past speakers. And it's going to be interesting. We'll talk about it a little bit later on, but how that influences what people see as the outlook for Welsh English at all. I want to play a quick clip so you can hear an example of what Welsh accent, a Welsh accent would sound like.
John, what are you doing? John, what are you doing? You notice that huge glide on John?
Kind of interesting. So there's a lot of kind of sing-songy nature to it that sets it apart from other English, and particularly obviously from British English or other surrounding areas. Probably the first historically significant event in terms of English within Wales occurs in the mid-1500s. There are a series of laws passed called the Laws and Wales Acts, and what they do is they elevate English over Welsh. At the same time, many of the monasteries within Wales are closed, leading to a reduction in language learning and acquisition centers within native Welsh tongue. This is accelerated even more so once the Industrial Revolution kicks off in the early 19th century. There are a lot of labor-intensive jobs needed, and Welsh workers go to fill those jobs, and they need to communicate on a daily basis in English rather than Welsh. So as you can see on the slide, most turn to English on a daily basis and become bilingual by the early 20th century. And the need for English over Welsh serves to further elevate English within the native country, and similar to many other places in the world, the need for the native tongue is minimized. There's a scholar named David Crystal, and he essentially points to these different events and essentially says that the dominance of English within Wales is really similar to how it spread in other parts of the world, although currently Welsh English has its little nuances that do still trace back to these historical roots within Welsh. So here are a few numbers from a 2011 census examining English usage within Wales. They're pretty self-explanatory. Over 98% of people are at least proficient. The one interesting tidbit is that 9% within the 3 to 15 category of people who are non-proficient in English. Some scholars have said that this is the beginning of evidence in their movement to try and establish Welsh again as the primary language, and that this is indicative of that. Most agree that it's too early to say, but will be kind of interesting to track that going forward. Here are a couple of the prominent features of Welsh English, starting with their tag question, isn't it? They just throw this on the end of sentences, tag it on, and it's kind of similar to the Spanish no, in that it's not really something that expects a direct answer, but it's a colloquial, hey, don't you think so, sort of deal that they throw on. Another key characteristic is they're changing around the subject and verb for different emphasis within the sentence.
When 9 years old, you reach look as good you are not.
There's one of the most famous Welsh English speakers of all time, Yoda. But they will move around those words and completely changes the sentence structure. Kind of interesting. Another last little tidbit is they do the where to. So where to is your ma'am, and that actually is also indicative that they use ma'am instead of mom, where it doesn't really function like that in British or American English, but where to is totally acceptable within Welsh English. There are a number of subdialects within Welsh English. North Welsh, South Welsh, and Cardiff are highlighted here. Cardiff in particular has that third-person singular verb conjugation, and that example, I lives in Cardiff, is also an example of something that British people in particular in the rest of the United Kingdom really look down on anyone who speaks like that. And it leads to some interesting perceptions in terms of valuing particular dialects over others and valuing Welsh English more or less. And a lot of times in terms of sheer volume, a lot less as compared to other English dialects within the United Kingdom. In terms of spelling, Welsh English differs very little from other dialects of British English. The exceptions that are found are usually in words that are descended from native Welsh that have not become anglicized over time. An example of this is the valley word, which is coombe, but rather than being spelled C-O-O-M-B-E, like it is in the rest of the United Kingdom and usually world, it's C-W-M, so coombe, really quite a lot different, obviously. The other thing that sets it apart, but it is in line with British English, is the preference of ISE over IZE in the suffixes of different words. In taking stock of current Welsh English trends and trying to predict the future outlook, it's important to note that Welsh people are particularly zealous in trying to keep their original language alive as compared to other cultural groups. This is significant in terms of Welsh English because the acquisition of native Welsh words and influence is predicted by most scholars to grow going forward. This is in contrast to precedent where English has been minimally influenced in terms of Wales because Wales has never served in that governing role where Latin, French, German, even Greek or Old Norse have all had a pretty significant amount of English. Wales itself hasn't had a very significant one. Going forward, however, Welsh English will likely gain a lot of its acquisition from that native Welsh tongue. The two articles kind of highlight what that will mean in terms of the United Kingdom as a whole. The Welsh Workers in Cardiff is an article where a Wales worker decided to put up a flag at a construction site after Wales beat England in a rugby game, and it was not appreciated by some of the local residents. And that second article is the future of duality of language, and essentially it's more looking at Welsh, but it has a significance in terms of Welsh English because there's a tension between the rest of the United Kingdom and Wales, and particularly those in Cardiff, where a lot of dialects are looked down on, and that tension is going to be interesting to examine going forward, where there's going to be this overlap, obviously, of these different barriers, and the digital influence of these different groups will be markedly different compared to just their intermingling physically in the past.